forced through an exorcism by cruel nuns. A Lakota chief stepped between and gave her peace. The rope they used was braided horsehair. I noticed that. Not hemp. Horsehair. Kind a man works slowly. Each strand twisted careful against his thumb. Someone had made that rope by hand. Patience. And then used it to bind a woman's wrists to a chair in what they called the house of God. I have carried many things in my life. I have carried a dead son down from the hills on my back. I have carried a treaty paper I knew was worthless into a room full of men who knew it too. I have carried the silence after a battle, which is the heaviest silence there is. But the sound I heard through that thin pine wall on a gray Tuesday in October, a woman's voice, stripped of everything but the animal core of it, begging. That is the thing I have carried longest. And the thing that is still with me on mornings when the cold comes in under the door and I lie, still, and do not move and just listen to the fire breathe. Let me go back to the beginning, or near enough to it. My name is Chayton Eagleheart. I was 53 years old that October. I had been a chief since I was 31, which is not a title the way whites use the word. It is a weight. And it sits across both shoulders, and it does not come off when you sleep. I led a band of perhaps 60 people. We had been pressed north and then west and then north again, and by that autumn we were camped in the draw south of a settlement called Creston Fork, which was 24 done buildings and a river crossing and a mission school, run by the Sisters of the Merciful Hand, which was what they called themselves. We traded with Creston Fork. Pelts, mostly. Sometimes horses. I did the trading myself because I spoke enough English, and because I had found over the years that when a chief comes in person, certain things do not happen that otherwise would, certain weights in trade, certain gestures. I am a tall man. I was taller then, before the years got at my spine. I wore my hair long, and I wore the 2 eagle feathers I had earned, and I looked men in the eye until they looked away, and it cost me nothing, and saved me a great deal. The mission sat at the east end of the main street, past the livery and the Lentoffites and the one saloon that did not have a sign. Stone foundation, pine boards above, whitewashed and gone gray in the weather. There was a schoolroom, and behind it a chapel, and behind that, connected by a covered walkway, a dormitory where they kept the Indian children they were turning into something else. I had opinions about that, kept them. I went into Creston Fork that October morning for salt and for flour, and because a man named Reardon owed me the second half of a payment from a horse trade in August, and Reardon was the kind of man who did not pay second halves unless you stood in front of him and waited. I got the salt. I got the flour. I was standing outside Neatsurst Reardon's land office, waiting for him to stop fussing with his ledger and just give me the $14 when I heard it. The mission chapel was close. 20 yards, maybe. The window was high and small and had no glass, just a piece of oilcloth tacked over it, and the oilcloth was loose at one corner, and through that loose corner the sound was coming out into the street. A woman's voice. Not crying, not screaming. Something between, and worse than either. A sound wrung out of a person who has been crying so long they can't do it properly anymore. And over it another voice, flat and rhythmic, Latin. Then a third voice, also flat, also rhythmic, answering, back and forth, like water running over the same stones. Reardon came to his door with my money, and I took it without counting it, which I never did, and he saw something in my face, and he took a step back. I walked to the mission door. I did not knock. The door was heavy and hung crooked in its frame, and I put my shoulder into it, and it opened the way, stuck things open. Sudden, like a held breath, let go. The schoolroom was empty. Slates on the wall with arithmetic, a smell of chalk and lamp oil, and something sharper under it that I did not name yet. The door to the chapel was at the far end. I crossed the schoolroom in 8 steps and opened that door too. There were 3 nuns. The one in front was the oldest, perhaps 60, and she had a face like a country that had known long wars, everything settled into its final shape. She held a Bible in both hands and she was reading from it in the flat voice I had heard. And she did not stop when I came in. Two others were younger. One held a crucifix, silver or pewter, I could not tell, and the other held a bowl of water and a switch of some dried plant I did not recognize. The woman in the chair was young, perhaps 20, perhaps not that. She had dark hair, and her head was down, and her wrists were tied to the chair arms with that braided horsehair rope, and her feet were bare on the stone floor. She was wearing a gray dress that was not hers, too large, too long, the collar loose on her shoulder. There were red marks on her neck, not rope marks, the kind that come from hands. The oldest nun finished her sentence and looked at me. "This is a house of God," she said. "You will leave." I looked at the woman in the chair. She had raised her head when I came in. She had dark eyes, and they were past fear by then, past most things. She looked at me with the flat exhaustion of someone who had stopped expecting anything good and had not yet learned to expect anything else. I said, in English, "Take the rope off her wrists." "This woman is afflicted," the nun said. "We are her only. Take the rope off her wrists." The nun's voice did not change. "You do not have authority here. You have no standing in this house or this settlement too." I walked past her. The younger nun with the crucifix moved to block me, and I looked at her, and she stopped moving. I went to the chair, and I looked at the rope, and I pulled the knife from my belt. It was my everyday knife, bone handle, 4-inch blade, kept sharp because a dull knife is an insult to the work it does. I cut the left wrist free, and then the right, and the woman's arms fell into her lap, and she looked at them as if they belonged to someone else. The oldest nun was still talking. I heard the words, lawless and heathen, and authority. And behind those words I heard something smaller and less sure, and I paid attention to that smaller thing. Crouched down in front of the chair. I was at eye level with the woman. Wrists had marks where the rope had been, not deep enough to bleed, but the skin was dark and puffy. I did not touch them. I said, quiet, just to her, "Can you walk?" She looked at me. She had a round face, perhaps Irish by the coloring before whatever had happened had taken the color out of it. She blinked, she nodded. "Then we are going to stand up," I said, "together, and we are going to walk out of here." She stood. She was unsteady, and I put my hand under her elbow, and she gripped my arm with both hands. Her fingers were cold, cold even through my coat sleeve, and we walked, past the nuns, through the door, through the schoolroom, out. The light in the street was flat and gray, and the woman stopped in it and just stood there with her face up like a plant that has been kept from the sun too long and is trying to remember how. Reardon was still at his door, $14 ago. 3 other men had stopped in the street. The livery boy, the man who owned the saloon with no sign, a woman in an apron whose name I never learned. I said to all of them, and none of them, "If anyone touches her, they will explain it to me." No one said anything. The mission door opened behind us. The oldest nun stood in it. "That woman is a danger to herself and others," she said. "She has exhibited signs of—" "What is her name?" I said. A pause. Clara Marsh." "Where is she from?" The nun's chin went up. "She came to us from—" "Where is she from?" "She has no family that—" "Then she will come with me. Until she says otherwise." Her name was Clara Marsh, and she had been a school teacher in a town 3 days east called Haverwood, and she had come west after her contract ended because there was nothing east holding her, with 2 dresses and a set of books in it and a small amount of money she had sewn into the lining of her coat, which was a thing she had thought to do in Haverwood before she left, and which turned out to have been wisdom. She told me this in pieces over the first several days. Not all at once. Real things do not come out all at once. They come the way water comes through old stone, one drop at a time through a crack that was always there. What had happened at the mission was this. She had arrived in Creston Fork 6 days before I did, and she had taken a room at the only boarding house, and on the 2nd day she had gone to see about a teaching position the settlement was supposed to have, and on the way back she had fainted in the street. Not her first time. She had a condition, her words, that caused her sometimes to lose consciousness, without warning. And her eyes would roll back, and her limbs would move without her wanting them to. And when she came out of it, she was confused and frightened for a few minutes before she was herself again. The housewoman had seen this once in the years before, and she knew what it was. But the woman in the apron who had found Clara in the street did not know. And she went to the mission challenge, and the mission had come for Clara, with the authority of God and the certainty of ignorance, which is a combination that has done more damage to this world than any winter I have ever known. They had kept her for 4 days. 4 days. She was 22 years old. She was a schoolteacher. She had done nothing except fall down in a street, in a town where no one knew what falling down could mean. I brought her to our camp. I consulted no one. This was not because I did not value counsel. I had people in that camp whose judgment I trusted more than my own on certain things. It was because there was nothing to consult about. A woman had been wronged, and she had nowhere to go, and she was still cold in October sunlight. These facts did not require a committee. My wife had been dead for 4 years. The camp knew me. They also knew, without being told, how to make room for someone who needs it. An older woman in our camp, a widow named Winona, came and sat with Clara that first afternoon without being asked. She brought food and a blanket, and she did not require anything in return. Not conversation, not gratitude, not explanation. She just sat. Watched this from across the camp, and I thought, this is what mercy actually looks like. Not the word, not the performance, the sitting. Clara slept for most of that first day. She ate a little in the evening. I checked on her twice, and both times she was quiet, and I left her quiet. The second morning she came out of Winona's tipi and stood in the early light and looked around at the camp, at the fire, at the horses in the rope corral, at the hills going gold in the distance, and I was across the way mending a bridle, and I watched her without appearing to, which was something I had learned from lifetime of watching things that needed not to feel watching. She stood there for a long time. Then she came and sat down near me, not across from me, not formally, just nearby, the way you sit near a fire for warmth without making an occasion of it. You cut the rope, she said. Yes, you didn't know me. No. She looked at her wrists. The marks were still there, yellowing now. Why? I set the bridle down. I thought about the question the way it deserved to be thought about. Because it was wrong, I said, and I was there. She nodded, just once, small. Then, she looked out at the hills. We sat like that for a while, maybe half an hour. Neither of us said anything else. It was comfortable, which surprised me. I had not been comfortable in silence with anyone for 4 years, as she stayed. This needs explaining because it was her choice, made in full possession of herself, and I want that understood. She was not trapped. She was not confused. She was not grateful to the point of helplessness. She was a woman who had weighed her situation with the clear eyes of someone who knew what had just been done to her, who knew the world she was in and the options it gave her, and she made a decision. She said this to me on the 4th day, directly and plainly. She said, I want to stay with your people for a while if you'll have me. I have skills that might be useful. I can teach, reading, numbers, some history. I am willing to work. I am not asking for charity. I said, I know you're not. I said, you're welcome here, she said. I'd like to learn some Lakota. I can't teach children in a language they don't share. I thought about that. Then I said, Winona will teach you. She nodded. Already practical, already looking at what was next. I walked away from that conversation with something sitting in my chest that I did not have a name for yet. It was not small, whatever it was. I was a man who had learned not to hurry things, and I left it where it was, and let it be. October became November. The cold came down from the north the way it always did, like a hand flat on the back of your neck. Clara had a gift for languages. Within 3 weeks she could ask a child its name and understand the answer. Within 6, she was holding simple conversations. The children were amused by her accent, the way she put the weight on a syllable that wanted no weight. But they were not unkind about it. Because children are not unkind when they are not taught to be. She taught in the mornings. Reading first, then numbers. She had brought her books, and she used them, and then she supplemented them with things she made herself. Letters cut from bark, numbers scratched in the dirt, stories told in both languages, side by side. She had a patient way of explaining things that never made a child feel foolish for not knowing. I sat in twice without announcing it, and I watched her, and I thought, someone taught her how to do this, or she was born knowing, and I could not always tell which. In the afternoons, she helped Winona and the other women with camp work. And this she was less skilled at, but more earnest about. And the women tolerated her clumsiness, and her earnestness the way they tolerated most things, with a humor that was affectionate rather than sharp. Winona had a particular laugh that came out when Clara did something exactly backward, but with great confidence, and it was a sound that I had not heard from Winona in a long time, and it did something to the air in the camp that I noticed. I had my own work. A chief's work is mostly managing, disputes within the band, relations with neighboring groups, the endless arithmetic of resources against need. That autumn, I was also in correspondence, if you can call it that, since I dictated to a mixed-blood interpreter, and the letters came back in English that had been through several hands. With a federal agent at Fort Laramie about the matter of a survey that was about to be run through land that was not the government's to survey. This was consuming and disparting because I knew how it would end. It always ended the same way. You wrote the letters anyway. You put the facts on paper, and you signed your name, and you wrote the letters. Clara knew about this. She asked me about it one evening, directly the way she asked about everything. I told her. She was quiet. Then she said, "May I read the letters?" I said yes. She read them. She took some time. Then she said, "The grammar is correct, but the tone is wrong. It's too deferential. These men understand one thing." She didn't say what thing. She didn't have to. You need to say what you will not accept, not what you hope for, what you will not accept. I looked at her for a moment. She said, "I've dealt with school boards. I know how people treat the language of requests. They need the language of facts," I said. "Write it then." She wrote it. She sat by the fire with my interpreter, and she drafted a letter and she read it back to me in English, and then Winona's son translated it for me, and I listened and I said, "Change two things," and she changed them, and we sent it. I do not know if the letter changed anything. The survey was run anyway, 3 months later, but I kept the draft. I still have it. Clara Marsh's handwriting, her tall, narrow letters, on paper that has gone yellow and soft. I have kept it because it is the first thing I can point to where I knew, not guessed, knew, that she was not here out of gratitude or convenience or fear of the alternative. She was here because she had decided this was where her judgment and her work were useful. And that was the only reason she ever needed for anything. December. Snow came in earnest, and the days shortened until the light was a thing you had to catch between other things. We had enough wood, food, warm sleeping, but enough in winter is a different feeling than enough in summer. It sits differently. You count it differently. Clara got sick. It was nothing dramatic. A cold that went deep and stayed. She coughed through the nights and ran a fever for 3 days, and her eyes were bright in the wrong way. Attended to her, and I came morning and evening and sat by the fire in Winona's teepee, and I did not pretend I was there for any other reason than to be near her. On the 3rd evening, the fever broke. I was there when it happened. She had been sleeping, and then she was awake, and her eyes were clear for the first time in days. And she looked at me sitting there by the fire, with my hands on my knees, and she said, voice rough from the coughing, "You look terrible." I said, "Thank you." She said, "Have you been here every evening?" I said, "Most." She looked at the fire. A long pause, then she said, "Chayton, am I?" She stopped. I waited. She said, "Am I someone you're responsible for? Or am I someone you?" She stopped again. I looked at her. She was 22, and I was 53, and she was flushed from a fever that had just and her hair was loose around her face. And she was watching me, with those dark eyes, and waiting, I said. You are someone I would walk into any room in the world for. She didn't say anything for a moment then. That's a different thing, I said. Yes, she said. I think I knew that. I said, I thought you might. She looked at the fire for a while. Then she said, good, just that, good. Sht. And she turned over and she went to sleep. And I sat by the fire for another half-hour, listening to her breathe. And then I went to my own teepee. I lay down and looked at the smoke hole and the stars through it. And I thought that I was 53 years old, and I had carried a great many things, and I was still, apparently, capable of being surprised. I am not going to tell this the way a younger man might. I am not going to tell it in a rush, all heat and urgency. It was not like that. It was not that kind of story between Clara and me. What it was this. A woman who had been treated as something less than she was, and a man who had the same experience by a different road, finding each other in the same winter, in the same valley, and discovering that the word for what they were to each other was not any word that was easy to say, but was real nonetheless. In January, she moved from Winona's tipi into mine. Winona helped her carry her things, which was a very small number of things, and Winona was smiling, and she said something in Lakota to Clara that I was not close enough to hear. And Clara laughed, and I thought, there is a sound I want to keep hearing for a long time. That night we lay beside each other in the dark, and the fire had gone down to coals and, outside, the wind moved across the flap of the teepee with a sound like a hand on cloth, and she said, tell me something about yourself that you haven't told anyone. A hard thing to ask. Harder than it sounds, at my age, when you have worn so many things down smooth with the telling. I thought for a while. Then I said, when my son died, I went 3 days without speaking, not because I was in ceremony, just because I had nothing left. And, on the 3rd day, a bird, a meadowlark, landed on a stone in front of me and sang, and I started talking again, because I did not want the bird to be the last voice I heard. She was quiet. Then she put her hand on my chest, just rested it there. Flat over the sternum, the way you check a thing to make sure it is still present. I put my hand over hers. We slept. I should tell you about the business with the mission, because it did not end with me walking Clara out of there. The oldest nun, I learned her name later, Sister Agatha, had written to the Territorial Marshal's office. She had filed, as near as I could piece it together, some kind of complaint. The exact nature was unclear. It may have been trespass. It may have been something to do with a ward of the mission, which was a phrase they used for the children in their care and which they appeared to believe could be extended to any Indian or partly Indian woman who crossed their threshold. The marshal sent a deputy. He arrived in February on a gray horse, and he had a letter from the territorial office. And he was young and cold and did not entirely want to be there, which was something I respected even if I did not make it easy on him. He came to our camp. I came out to meet him, and I stood with 2 of my men, and we waited while he dismounted and took off his gloves. He said he had a complaint regarding the removal of a ward of the Merciful Hand mission. I said, who is the ward? He consulted his letter. He said, a woman named Clara Marsh. I said, Clara Marsh is a schoolteacher from Haverwood, 22 years old. Arrived in Creston Fork by her own choice, and was detained by the mission without her consent and held against her will. She is not a ward of anything or anyone. The deputy looked at his letter and then at me. He said, is she here? I said, yes. He said, I speak with her? I said, you could ask her. Clara came out herself. She had heard. She stood beside me, not behind me, beside me. And she looked at the deputy, and she said, in a voice that had nothing in it but plain fact, my name is Clara Marsh. I am a certified schoolteacher. I was detained at the mission for 4 days against my will. I am here by my own choice. I am not a ward of the mission or anyone else, and I have not committed any crime, and neither has this man. The deputy looked at his letter for a while. Then he said, I'll need to make a report. Clara said, that's fine. Include the horsehair rope on the chair. The deputy folded his letter. He said to me, not unkindly, "Chief, recommend you stay out of Creston Fork for a while," I said. "I have salt and flour coming from Reardon." He almost smiled. He said, "Maybe have someone else pick it up." He rode back the way he came. We did not hear from the marshal's office again. Sister Agatha left Creston Fork the following spring. I did not know this at the time. I learned it later from Reardon, told me, with a look on his face that was trying to be neutral, and not entirely succeeding. She had been reassigned to a mission in New Mexico, he said. I did not think much about it. People are moved around by the forces above them. It is not a thing that requires comment. What I thought about instead was what Clara had said, standing next to me in the snow, with her voice plain and steady. "Neither has this man." 4 words. She had put herself between me and whatever the deputy's letter was going to say. And she had done it, without asking my permission, and without calculation, just because it was the true thing to say and she was the one standing there who could say it. 4 words, and they were for me. I have not forgotten them. Spring. The world came back the way it always did, unreasonably. Green where there had been white, the river running brown and cold and fast, the horses restless in the rope corral, feeling the change in the air. Clara expanded the school. She had been teaching perhaps a dozen children through the winter. By May it was closer to 20, which included 2 children from a mixed blood family that had settled in the valley, and 3 more who came from a Cheyenne band, camped some miles north, whose mothers had heard there was a woman who taught in both languages and did not make a child feel like a problem to be solved. I watched this growth with the same feeling I had whenever the band was healthy and the children were fed, and the work was being done well. A feeling that has no single word, but is made up of several things together. Responsibility fulfilled, which is its own satisfaction, and something that is not pride exactly, but is close to it. And under those, quieter, the awareness that what you have built could always be taken, which is what keeps you careful. I talked to Clara about that. The care. She understood it. She had her own version of it. The teacher's version was, you could give a child everything you had and still not know, until years later, whether it had landed. You worked in the dark and you trusted the work and you waited, I said. That's what I do, she said. I know, I've watched you. I looked at her. She was making something with her hands. A repair to a basket that Winona had asked her to do, and she was doing it slowly and badly, and she knew it, and she was doing it anyway. She said, without looking up, "You think I haven't been watching you since October?" I said, "I thought you were busy," she said. "I can do 2 things at once. There is a moment I want to tell you about. I have saved it. Not the most dramatic thing that happened between us. It wasn't that kind of moment. It is the one that stays." July. The heat in the valley was close and dry, and the light at late afternoon came in sideways through the cottonwoods, along the river, and made everything gold and long-shadowed. I had been in a long and difficult conversation with 3 men from a neighboring band about a water rights matter that had been building for 2 years, and by the time it was done and I had walked back to camp, I was tired in the way that has nothing to do with the body. I sat down by the river a little ways from the camp. Just sat, watching the water. Clara found me there. I don't know how she knew where I was. She didn't say anything. She just came and sat down next to me on the bank, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her arm against mine. After a while she said, "Was it bad?" I said, "It will be bad again in a year," she said. "But not today," I said, "not today." She leaned her head against my shoulder, just rested it there, the way her hand had rested on my chest that night in December, checking to make sure something was present. I put my arm around her. The river went by. A hawk went over. The cottonwood leaves turned in a breath of air that came from nowhere and went back to nowhere. She said, quiet, "Carry all of it." I said, "That's the job." She said, "I know. I'm not saying you shouldn't. I'm saying I see it, see it." 3 words. She wasn't offering to take it. She wasn't offering to fix it. She was not pretending she could carry what I carried, or that she understood everything it meant to be who I was in the world I was in. She was saying, I see you carrying it, and I am here, and that is what I am choosing. I held her there for a while. The light went gold, and then copper, and then gray, and the air cooled, and neither of us moved until it was almost dark. Then she said, I'm hungry, I said, so am I. We went back to camp. I am telling you this from the far side of many years. This is what I know. I was 53 years old when I walked into that chapel and cut the rope off her wrists, and I thought I knew what my life was going to be, thought I had the shape of it. A man learns the shape of his life, learns to live inside it, stops expecting it to surprise him. But life does not check with you before it surprises you. That is both the injustice of it and the grace. What I did not expect, at 53, was to find a woman who made me feel like my years were an asset and not a diminishment. Who asked what I thought and meant it, said I see it and made those 3 words mean 100 others. Who stood beside me in the snow and told a deputy's letter that this man had done nothing wrong, not because she owed me, not because she was afraid, but because it was true, and she was the one who could say it, and she said it. The mission had tied her to a chair and spoken Latin at her because they did not understand what she was. And they were afraid of what they didn't understand. And she had been afraid too by the end of those 4 days. I will not pretend she wasn't. That kind of thing does not leave clean. She healed. Not fast. Not all the way to the same as before. It doesn't work that way. But she came out of it. And what came out was her. The directness, the patience, the laugh that sounded like it, had decided to be a laugh instead of something else, and was committed to it. She took what had been done to her, and she did not let it be the biggest thing about her. I admired her for that more than I found words to say, which is a thing that happens when you admire something true. We built something in that valley, Clara and I. Not a house, not at first. Something before a house. An understanding. A practice. She taught and I led, and we talked in the evenings about both. And sometimes we agreed, and sometimes we did not. And the times we did not were often more useful than the times we did, because Clara Marsh did not soften her opinion to be agreeable, and I had learned long ago to value that quality, highly, and never expect it. The children who learned to read that year, and the year after. Some of them are grown now. Some of them are leading their own families, their own small bands, their own pieces of a world that is harder now than it was and will be harder still. I think about them sometimes. I think about the letters Clara made from bark. I think about her voice saying a word in Lakota with the wrong syllable carrying the weight, and the children laughing, and Clara laughing too, not embarrassed but genuinely amused, because she was a woman who knew what mattered, and a mispronounced syllable was not it. What mattered was the work. What mattered was the showing up. What mattered was being present and honest and useful to the people around you, and not pretending you were something you weren't. These are the things I had tried to live by for 50 years. And here was a woman who lived by them too, not because I had taught her. She had been living by them long before that October morning, but because this was simply who she was, made by her own history, and her own choices, and her own particular understanding of what a person owed to the world. She chose me knowing all of that about herself. That is what I am saying. She chose me in full possession of her own strength and her own judgment to see me, not because she needed saving, but because she had looked at what I was and decided it was worth something. I do not have a word for what that does to a man. I know what it did to me. The last thing I will tell you is not dramatic. It is just true. There is a ridge above our camp, east-facing, where I went sometimes, in the early morning to watch the sun come up. I had gone there since I was young, when my father first showed me the place and told me, "Stand here and you can see everything that's coming." He meant it practically. From that ridge you can see 3 valleys and 2 river crossings, and the long flat stretch to the north where weather comes. You can see what's coming before it arrives. I went there one morning in our second autumn together. Before dawn, the air was cold and clean, and the stars were still out in the west, and to the east the sky was just beginning to lighten at the edge. I heard her coming up the slope before I saw her. She had on her heavy coat, and her hair was down, and she had brought 2 cups of coffee, which we had started keeping in the camp, because she could not begin a morning without it. And she had eventually persuaded Winona, and then slowly, most of the camp that this was a reasonable position. She came and stood beside me and handed me a cup. I said, "How did you know I was here?" she said. "You always come here when something is going to happen." I said, "Nothing is going to happen today." She said, "Good, then we can just watch." We watched. The light came in from the east the way it does at that elevation. Slow first and then sudden. The hills going from black to green in what feels like a single breath. The frost on the grass caught it and held it. Somewhere below in the valley a horse moved, and its tack jingled once and was quiet. Clara drank her coffee. I drank mine. She was warm beside me, and the cup was warm in my hands, and the morning was coming in the way. Mornings have always come and will keep coming, without asking anything of you, just arriving, she said, not looking at me, looking at the valley. "I'm glad I came to Creston Fork," I said. "Even the mission?" A pause. She said, "That part I could have done without." I said, "Yes," she said. "But the rest?" I said, "Yes." She looked at me then. Just looked. The way she had looked at me from that chair in October. But not the same. Nothing of that exhaustion or that flatness. This was clear-eyed and present and particular. The way she looked at everything she had decided mattered. She said, "You're a good man, Chayton. Plain as that. No decoration." A fact stated by someone who had taken the time to find out if it was true. I looked at the valley below us. I said, "Try to be." She nodded. She looked back at the light coming in. She reached over, without looking, and put her hand into mine, and I closed my fingers around it. We stood there until the frost was gone, and the valley was fully awake below us, and the coffee was long finished. And there was no reason to stay except that neither of us had moved. Some mornings are like that. Some mornings you just stand there and hold on to what you have.